Russia cannot afford peace in Ukraine. For most nations, peace marks the end of a conflict. But for Russia in 2025, peace in Ukraine would mark the beginning of a systemic collapse. This war is no longer just about territory or control. This has become the scaffolding that is holding together the modern Russian state. Since launching the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Russia has undergone some pretty significant transformations. The Kremlin has centralized power, they have outlawed dissenting voices, including Amnesty International, and they have restructured their economy to prioritize military production and spending. The military itself has been overhauled, with the composition of its forces being fundamentally different today than it was 4 years ago, and the defense industry having been ramped up to unprecedented levels. Socially, the war has been woven into the fabric of Russia's national identity, with propaganda campaigns glorifying the conflict and suppressing alternative or conflicting narratives. All the while, economically, sanctions have strained the economy, but the war effort has become the central driver for Russia's economy. In this video, we're going to analyze how Russia has evolved into a wartime nation through the PMESII framework, just as we have in many other videos, to understand why a peace deal in Ukraine could unravel the very foundations of the modern Russian state. Even if this war is not in and of itself an existential conflict for Russia as a state, it is existential for Vladimir Putin and his own hold on power. And we're about to see exactly why that is. But before we do all that, there's a word from today's video sponsor, and that's me. I'm launching a Patreon to support this channel. This will help me to pay for video editing and other key capabilities that help me to grow the quality of these videos and potentially one day the quantity of these videos. And because of that, I'm not going to ask for donations here. And yes, I do have a Buy Me a Coffee if that's interesting to you. I don't market that because I would rather just provide some sort of additional service in return for your support. And that's all in addition to the free YouTube content that I'm making here right now. This, of course, takes me to the Patreon, where my members will receive weekly intelligence reports made by me on the top 5 international stories from the previous week. The analyst tier will receive this report, as well as receiving access to my videos early and weekly recognition at the end of every video. The senior analyst tier will receive all of those benefits, and they will also receive a monthly priority topic request that will be covered in greater depth in the following weekly report. So if you are somebody that's planning to travel somewhere and you want to know about the security situation in that place, or you have a business interest somewhere, or you're just curious about something, you can pop that question or that topic request into the membership. I'll do some research on it and I will present it in the next report for the group. I'll probably be adding more features to this in the future as we move along, but this is what I'm starting with right now. New analyst members will receive their first 7 days for free, so you can kind of see what we've got going so far and see if this is something that you're interested in before you actually commit. Check the link to the Patreon down in the video description for more. With all that, back to the video. Since the invasion began, Putin's grip on power has only tightened, not because of strength, but out of necessity. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, it marked a critical turning point, not just for Ukraine, but for Russia itself. Almost overnight, the Kremlin began restructuring Russia's political landscape to align almost entirely around Vladimir Putin and the war effort. Sweeping wartime laws were very swiftly enacted, providing the regime with extensive new powers. These laws centralized virtually all forms of political dissent, labeling critics of the war as traitors, spies, or foreign agents. Opposition figures were silenced or outright imprisoned. Independent media outlets such as Novaya Gazeta or Dozhd TV were shuttered or driven into exile. And a climate of fear has been purposefully cultivated to discourage public protest or criticism. By this point in mid-2025, Amnesty International reports that Russia has imprisoned over 20,000 citizens for anti-war activities. And this all reinforces Putin's absolute control over public discourse. This crackdown was not solely about silencing the opposition, though. It is strategically designed to centralize authority directly around Putin himself. Political institutions that had previously held nominal independence, such as regional governments, parliamentary bodies, or even courts, now find their roles dramatically diminished, becoming mere extensions of the executive branch. Key decision-making power has steadily migrated towards Putin's inner circle. This has created a regime increasingly defined by loyalty rather than by competency or governance, and this is something that is consistent with what we have seen out of the Russian military in this war. The war has also reshaped the very delicate balance of power between Putin and Russia's influential oligarchs. Initially wary of a conflict that brought devastating Western sanctions, oligarchs were pacified by promises that victory would be quick and it would vastly expand Russia's geopolitical and economic dominance. Putin framed this war not merely as territorial expansion, but the reassertion of Russia's greatness, basically a callback to the vision that appealed to nationalistic sentiments among the elite. And of course, it was described as being a quick 14-day special military operation. There wasn't even a need to declare this a war. In fact, the word war was outlawed in Russia. Yet this grand narrative has proven to be incredibly fragile, and it failed almost immediately. We're now more than 3 years into this 14-day special military operation that the Russian government themselves will occasionally refer to as a war. After more than 3 years and immense casualties, the promise of a swift victory is gone completely. The oligarchs, now facing frozen overseas assets and restricted global businesses, have invested very heavily and have lost a lot due to Putin's gamble. Should Russia choose to negotiate a peace without any kind of clear victory or gain, these oligarchs would immediately demand answers and possibly accountability for the immense sacrifices and losses. After all, what was the whole point for this whole thing in the end? This dissatisfaction could rapidly escalate into a crisis within Russia's power structure. A peace deal, especially one perceived as a concession or a defeat, would risk Putin's carefully maintained coalition of elites. Without the war unifying external threats, internal tensions, rivalries, and power struggles, all of which are currently suppressed under wartime narratives and laws, would emerge sharply into public view. Putin, who is, of course, acutely aware of Russian historical precedent, knows that political instability following failed military campaigns has really bit Russia in the behind a lot in the past, whether that's the Romanovs after World War I or Gorbachev in the Soviet Union after the Afghanistan War. For Putin, peace is not merely an end of hostilities, it would mark the beginning of a potentially existential reckoning. His regime has effectively bound its legitimacy and stability to the continuation and ultimate success of this war. The very foundation of Putin's power, fear, nationalism, and elite complicity are contingent upon maintaining this conflict and achieving a victory in the end. Ending the war prematurely, or even through a compromise, threatens to expose the deep political fissures that the Kremlin has sought to conceal all this time. Thus, for Russia's political elite in 2025, continuing the war is no longer merely about geopolitical ambition, it's a matter of political survival. And continuing the war isn't just an easy feat on its own. We're going to discuss the military and economic strain that this war has had in just a moment, but Russia's objectives in the war haven't really changed all that much since it began. Putin still wants a new government in Kiev that is sympathetic to Russia, even if he has publicly softened a bit. He still demands that Ukraine gives up expansive areas that they still hold all across southern and eastern Ukraine. Doing so would be politically, militarily, and economically disastrous for Ukraine, so this is effectively a non-starter. And so the only option that Putin is trying to leave left is just to continue fighting. Even if a ceasefire is reached, it's doubtful that that would even bring a lasting peace deal. Instead, it would really allow both sides time to recover before resuming fighting. And that is really why Russia doesn't want a ceasefire unless Ukraine is not allowed to receive new arms during that time. They basically want themselves to recover while not having Ukraine recover at the same time. In essence, it is a bad faith attempt at a ceasefire. And this is consistent with messaging that we've seen from Russian officials, including in Istanbul, that they don't really mind fighting any longer. For example, the Russian delegation in Istanbul that met with Ukrainian officials said that Russia is willing to continue fighting for another 20 years. And this is likely going to be untrue because math exists, but the sentiment is definitely revealing. Russia's military is not just fighting in Ukraine, it's being rebuilt in Ukraine. Over 3 years of brutal fighting have transformed the Russian military into a war-hardened institution deeply intertwined within the nation's political and economic fabric. This evolution has created a military apparatus that thrives on continuous warfare, making peace not just undesirable, but potentially destabilizing not just for the regime, but for the military itself. A protracted war has necessitated significant changes to Russia's military structure and command. The formation of the 18th Combined Arms Army in Crimea back in 2023 really shows this shift, consolidating forces to enhance operational effectiveness in southern Ukraine, where they really anticipate the fighting to continue well into the future after 2023. Additionally, the establishment of the Russian Unmanned Systems Forces this year shows that they're adapting to the war as it is and the technological transformations that have taken place. Prior to the invasion, Russia's military relied heavily on professional, contract-based soldiers. However, the casualty rates that they suffered in the first couple years have significantly depleted this core. And this has led to a reliance on conscripts and other unconventional recruitment methods. Notably, up to 180,000 convicts have been recruited with promises of sentence reductions, fundamentally altering the composition and discipline of the Russian military. This is an initiative that was initially spearheaded by the Wagner Group, and this was later institutionalized by the Russian Ministry of Defense. Convicts have been offered incentives like sentence reductions or financial compensation or outright expungement if they join penal units like the Storm Z and their successor Storm V. These units often receive extremely minimal training, sometimes a week to 2 weeks of training at all, and have been deployed to very high-risk combat zones, and that leads to very significant casualties. Russia has also implemented legislative changes to widen the conscription pool. For example, the maximum draft age has been increased from 27 to 30 years old, and the list of medical conditions that warrant deferment has been shortened. Russia has also set up a unified digital register that establishes and streamlines the distribution of conscription notices to reduce draft evasion. The Russian government has introduced substantial financial incentives as well to attract volunteers. Reports suggest that in 2024, recruitment targets were outright surpassed, with over 440,000 new soldiers enlisted. Some of these recruited individuals were facing legal challenges and were offered the opportunity to join the military in lieu of prosecution. That effectively uses enlistment as a means to avoid trials. Russia has also turned to foreign nationals to supplement its forces. Investigations have identified over 15,000 foreign mercenaries from 48 countries recruited between April 2023 and May of 2024. These individuals were processed through official military selection points in Moscow. Notably, Chinese nationals have been among those recruited, with some reportedly being enticed directly through social media platforms like TikTok, offering lucrative financial incentives. Russia is also turning to North Korean soldiers to help fight in parts of Russia. Beyond traditional recruitment, Russia has focused on specific demographics, including foreign students and labor migrants. Some African students in Russia, for example, were reportedly recruited into military service, sometimes under very coercive circumstances. The reintegration of war-hardened veterans and former convicts after a peace deal poses significant challenges for Russia. Many of these individuals who have become accustomed to the violence of the front lines, who return to civilian life with very limited support, and that has already today led to an increased crime rate and social unrest from those individuals. The government's options here are very limited. They can either reincarcerate them and risk political backlash, or neglect them, which risks destabilization. Russia's military has evolved into an institution that not only engages in warfare, but is structured around warfare. The intertwining of military operations with political control and economic stability means that peace could unravel the very fabric of the state. Without a war to fight, Russia's military becomes a liability, not a tool. Economically, sanctions have impacted Russia's economy very deeply, but the war has repurposed their economy. Since the onset of the invasion, Russia has transformed its economy into a war-centric model. Defense spending has become the primary driver of GDP growth. employment, and industrial activity. In 2025, the military expenditure is projected to reach 15.5 trillion rubles, accounting for approximately 7.2% of GDP. This is a significant increase from previous years. The surge in defense spending has led to nationalization and militarization of factories, contracts, and supply chains. The arms industry now employs around 3.8 million people, representing a substantial portion of the manufacturing workforce. Production lines are operating around the clock to meet the demand. However, this war-driven economic model is unsustainable in the long term. A longer-term cessation of hostilities, including a peace deal, would likely result in decreased demand for military goods, and that would lead to factory closures, mass layoffs, and a significant drop in state revenues. If sanctions remain on Russia and greater global investment does not return, then where do these people go who have been laid off? The economy, which is now heavily reliant on these defense contracts, would face a severe downturn, and that is unless a new security crisis could lead to renewed demand. And none of this is going to happen overnight. Russia will need to ultimately rebuild its military, and that will take years and cost a lot of money, but it will also keep the factories open and employ a lot of people. But increased government investment in defense when there isn't a war on, while social investments and infrastructure suffer from a lack of investment, will ultimately lead to some questions on why none of that is actually happening. For Russians, it's great that people are making money, but if they can't spend it and the quality of life has noticeably declined, then that is a problem. Moreover, the financial obligations associated with the war are already beginning to mount. The government faces substantial costs related to the signing of new recruits, compensating soldiers or their families for injuries or fatalities. This expenses strain the national budget, with the Russian National Wealth Fund's liquid reserves dwindling to $31 billion by November of 2024. And that's down from $117 billion in 2021. While the economy can continue in this state for a limited time, the tab is coming due. China's economic support and the very skillful management of the Russian central bank have provided some temporary relief, but the underlying issues persist. The economy is built on bad political fundamentals and a reliance on conflict. And without the impetus for war, that risks a complete collapse. So really, no matter what any Russian politician says, they cannot continue this war forever. There will come a time where Russia is going to have to either soften its demands in Ukraine for a ceasefire where it can catch its breath before ultimately resuming fighting, or risk economic fracture. Russia's economy does not just run through oil and gas anymore, it runs through artillery shells. And if peace is reached and Russia is looking at a situation where they are risking economic collapse, Western sanctions being lifted could provide them an out. So that is a potential interesting thing that we could witness happen if a peace agreement is made where Western sanctions are lifted, and that really forgoes any kind of economic collapse within Russia, because then the industry can just retransition back to what it was pre-war. However, that would certainly lead to some frustration and protest, especially in Ukraine, that they would feel like there was really no punishment for Russia for what happened. Since the onset of the Ukraine invasion, the Russian state has meticulously crafted a narrative portraying the conflict as an existential struggle for national survival. State-controlled media and educational institutions have all propagated the idea that the war is a continuation of Russia's historical mission to protect its sovereignty and cultural identity. This narrative has been reinforced through various channels, including the glorification of soldiers as heroes and the suppression of dissenting voices. And nowhere is this more on display than during their annual May 9th Victory Day parade. The Russian government has implemented extensive propaganda campaigns to bind the war to the national identity and its historical destiny. These efforts have included promotion of patriotic education in schools, the celebration of military achievements in public ceremonies, and the dissemination of pro-war messages throughout state media. By framing the conflict as a just and heroic endeavor, the Kremlin has sought to galvanize public support and suppress opposition. However, this is all coming at a very human cost that is becoming increasingly staggering. Some estimates show that in April 2025, Russia suffered over 790,000 military casualties, including 185,000 fatalities. Ukraine claims over 980,000 casualties by the time that I'm making this video, and by the time that this video is actually released, it's probably going to be somewhere closer to the 1 million mark. I've said this before, and I'll say this again. I think that Ukraine's estimates are likely a high estimate, but it's no less significant because it's not that far ahead of third-party estimates. This makes the invasion of Ukraine the most devastating war for Russia since World War II. And despite the losses, the Russian government has continued to downplay the toll, maintaining tight control over casualty figures and limiting independent reporting. That's why I keep citing Ukrainian estimates, because the Russian estimates are so low, it's just not realistic. Independent researchers, including Oryx back in the day, had already shown that Russian losses were far greater than what Russia's official reporting had shown. The potential for peace also poses a significant challenge to the state's narrative. An end of hostilities would force Russia to confront the true extent of its losses and the reality of the war's outcomes. And this reckoning could lead to widespread disillusionment, particularly among the families of the fallen and the broader public who has been subjected to years of state propaganda. Returning soldiers would also be facing a host of challenges, including psychological trauma, economic hardship, and social reintegration difficulties that are really common in any army that is returning home. This isn't unique to Russia, but it's certainly still a problem. Reports indicate that approximately 20% of Russia's veterans already suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, but that number is likely to be a heck of a lot higher, especially by the end of the war. And this is with very limited access to adequate mental health services. The lack of support systems for these individuals really raises a lot of concerns about potential increases for crime, substance abuse, and alcoholism, as well as social unrest. The reintegration of these veterans into a society grappling with economic instability and political repression presents a very complex issue. Many of these returning soldiers may struggle to find employment or purpose, and this leads to emotions and feelings of alienation and resentment. This situation could exacerbate existing social tensions and undermine the state's efforts to maintain control. In the information space, the Russian government has meticulously constructed a tightly controlled information environment to justify and sustain support for the war. This ecosystem is not designed to accommodate peace. It thrives on the perpetuation of the conflict. Russian media outlets are predominantly state-controlled, disseminating narratives that portray the war as a necessary defense against Western aggression and Ukrainian nationalism. This portrayal taps into historical sentiments, likening the current conflict to the Great Patriotic War in World War II, thereby invoking a sense of patriotic duty amongst the populace. The government's messaging and themes of heroism, sacrifice, and the existential threat posed by the West reinforce and justify the ongoing war. To maintain this narrative, the Russian government has enacted stringent censorship laws criminalizing the dissemination of information that contradicts official accounts of the war. Independent media outlets have been shut down or forced into exile, and individuals expressing anti-war sentiments face legal repercussions, including jail time. This suppression extends to labeling organizations like Amnesty International as undesirable, which effectively bans them from operating within Russia and criminalizes association with them. This ongoing war serves as a unifying force within Russia, allowing the government to frame dissenters as traitors and to rally the public through support and a shared sense of purpose. This war narrative provides a convenient scapegoat for domestic issues, attributing economic hardships and social unrest and infrastructure failure to external threats rather than internal policy failures. A transition to peace would challenge the very foundations of this constructed reality. Without the backdrop of war, the government's narrative would face scrutiny, and the public might begin to question the legitimacy of the sacrifices that were made. The absence of a unifying enemy could lead to increased visibility of domestic issues, potentially eroding trust in the government. It would also lead to some significant and I think profound questions about why peace was possible in the first place if the war itself was existential. After all, if the enemy truly was evil, then why make peace with them if they can still be destroyed? And if they cannot be destroyed, even though Russia has this big and powerful army, then did the Russian leaders fail? And what does this mean? These are not exactly questions that Putin wants people to be asking. You can't just flip a switch from you can't just flip a narrative switch from total victory to a negotiated retreat. In essence, the Russian information apparatus is intricately linked to the perpetuation of the war. Peace threatens to unravel this carefully maintained narrative, exposing the populace to alternative perspectives, and this undermines the government's control over public perception. Russia has also restructured its infrastructure to support a prolonged war effort. This transformation includes the development of new rail lines, factories, and energy projects, all tailored to sustain military operations. The Russian government has invested heavily in expanding its military-industrial complex over the years. For example, new explosive factories are under construction in Siberia to increase the amount of munitions used for Ukraine. In addition, new factories producing drones have been developed to indigenize the Iranian Shahed drone. While military infrastructure is seen as a major investment, civilian infrastructure has still suffered. Healthcare facilities, housing, and public services have experienced decay or have been repurposed for military use. This war-driven infrastructure drive is heavily dependent on the continuation of the conflict, of course, for its sustainability. A transition to peace would likely expose the fragility of the system, leading to economic downturns, layoffs, and social unrest. The economy, having been repurposed to support the war, may struggle to adapt to peacetime needs. In essence, Russia's infrastructure has been transformed into a war machine that is very difficult to reverse. The focus on military needs has come at the expense of civilian well-being, and the long-term consequences of this shift are still very uncertain. It's also not yet clear just how long this can last, even after a ceasefire, assuming Russia continues its high defense spending to rebuild its military. In the span of just a few years, Russia's evolved into a country fundamentally defined by its invasion of Ukraine. Politically, Vladimir Putin has leveraged wartime necessity to crush dissent, consolidate power, and stave off any kind of resistance. Militarily, the conflict has reshaped the Russian armed forces into an entity dependent on continued conflict to maintain discipline, employment, and structure. Economically, the war has become an essential engine for growth and employment, even if it is draining Russia's long-term reserves, and if they can't continue this forever. Socially, the state has crafted a narrative of existential struggle and national martyrdom to justify immense sacrifices. And in terms of infrastructure, the nation's very fabric has been recalibrated around the conflict. Peace, paradoxically, would present a greater risk to Putin's regime than continued war. It would expose the hollow promises that Putin has made to Russian society. It would unravel the economic house of cards built on a wartime production and provoke hard questions from grieving families about the legitimacy and necessity of their sacrifice. The Russian state as it currently stands is simply not designed for this kind of transformation. It's designed for survival under siege. While ending the war might preserve lives in Ukraine, it could spark profound instability within Russia itself. And so the tragedy here is that Russia is in fact trapped. Continuing the war deepens the crisis, but ending the war could precipitate the collapse of the political, military, and economic pillars that are holding Putin's regime in place. The longer this war continues, the more difficult escaping this trap becomes. And eventually, the bill that Russia has accumulated over the years will come due. Peace may save countless lives abroad, but within Russia, it risks unraveling the very threads that currently bind the nation together. Leave a comment on if you think that Russia can afford peace and what you think is going to happen next within Russia if a ceasefire were agreed to. Do you believe that Russia can actually sustain any kind of long-term peace? Like this video if you found it interesting and share it with a friend. Also subscribe for more analysis just like this one every week. And join the Patreon if you're interested in my assessments on the top 5 weekly events in geopolitics. With all that, I'll see y'all next time. Later.